Hello, welcome to an interview. We're interviewing my friend Feingeist right here, and today we're going to be talking about something that he's been pretty persuasive to me about. We're going to be talking about process philosophy today, and specifically we're going to be talking about how process philosophy relates to my audience, which my audience is made up of anarchists, anarcho-capitalists, and objectivists. So without further ado, who are you, Feingeist?
Well, I'm an economist by training, a philosopher by inclination, libertarian by conviction, I'd say, an agorist to be more precise, and I've sort of had a very odd philosophical and political trajectory. And not to make a very long story short, where I'm now is I'm an agorist, and in my metaphysics I'm a process philosopher. And I think one of the reasons why we got along was because I used to be an objectivist, so we can kind of speak the same philosophical lingo, and I could sort of, argue from that position as well.
All right. And how did our relationship start?
Right, so I think I remember seeing one of your videos. You made a very persuasive argument. I can't remember what the video was at the moment. On Stoicism, yeah, exactly. And you were saying how you were no longer a Stoic, you were an objectivist, but you still kept some things from Stoicism. And I was like, we had a pretty similar philosophical trajectory in that sense. I, too, was very into Stoicism at one point and into objectivism. So I was like, this guy seems very intelligent, he seems open-minded and open to dialogue. So I just wrote in the comments, I used to be an objectivist myself. Now I've changed my mind since, but I would love to sort of debate you on it. And so I hopped on the Discord, and we've been talking about it for a pretty long time now.
Yes, on and off, talking about a variety of subjects within and outside of process philosophy. And it's been quite a, as you may account, a progressive journey from me going, yeah, those are some novel ideas, to, oh shit, I think you're onto something.
Yeah, essentially.
And so, just a little bit about me. I am also an agorist. I think around last year I started reopening up to the position of agorism. But, without further ado, I think my audience knows me, and I think this video is going to be more about for my audience. So without further ado, let's get into the questions. My first question is, what is process philosophy? And after that, we should talk about substance philosophy. But first, what is process philosophy? And if you want to start with substance, we can do that too.
Yeah, I think that's the easiest way to define it. Because when you start off with, what is the implicit philosophy that most average people hold today? At least in the Western world, it's going to be substance philosophy. So there exist these substances, things happen to those substances, like change is something that occurs to something that exists independently. So the idea would be the, classical, you wouldn't call it a syllogism, but the classical example would be, there's Socrates, the substance of Socrates. Socrates becomes sick, but the sickness does not fundamentally alter the substance that is Socrates. Another way to say it would be, with the Heraclitus-Parmenides dynamic. Heraclitus is very famous for saying, no man can step into the same river twice, everything flows. So the idea of process philosophy is a lot more Heraclitean, whereas substance philosophy leans a lot more Parmenidean in that change is somehow epiphenomenal or entirely illusory. And I have to define it very vaguely because process philosophy is a very, very broad term. So the first process philosophers were the Taoists, actually. And later Western process philosophers, among the Western ones, the first one was Heraclitus. And more recently in the 19th and 20th centuries, I'm personally a disciple of Alfred North Whitehead and Henri Bergson. But they're all very radically different in their metaphysics. The only thing they reject is this idea of Cartesian substance that's the cause of itself.
Just
something
like how
that exists.
I was about to say, yeah. Just like how the broad school of substance philosophy also has wild variations, because these are very meta positions.
Extraordinarily wild. Yes. These are very sort of meta position kind of things. So if someone says they're a process philosopher,
it's like they're saying a leftist.
If they say, Essentially, yeah, but not quite, because if they say there's very few process philosophers compared to substance philosophers. So if they say they're a process philosopher, you can basically hone in on, okay, they're probably going to be a Whiteheadian or a Bergsonian.
You could say a leftist from the 1500s, perhaps.
Yeah, something like that, when it wasn't a very common position to hold. But if you say I'm a substance philosopher, you go, well, what does that mean? You could be a Cartesian, a Spinozist, an Aristotelian. You could even, a modern day, like, reductionist physicalist. Even some varieties of idealist, I'd count them among substance philosophers. But so it's not calling yourself a substance philosopher isn't a very good descriptor.
All right. So now that we've covered the main background and gave a touch on what is substance philosophy, and maybe perhaps just because we went on a little bit of a historical tangent, may you summarize the substance position?
Sure. Well, there's a classical substance position, which is, the Aristotelian idea of substance.
Perhaps maybe we should hone in on specifically, for my audience, the objectivists or the ANCAP crowd.
The ANCAP crowd, yes.
Appeal to
That's
them.
where I was going. But so you sort of have. This is why I started with Aristotle, because Rand obviously claims to take a lot of inspiration from Aristotle, but her idea of substance is very Cartesian.
Then perhaps you could Perhaps you could explain a Cartesian substance philosophy.
Yes. A Cartesian substance is, in Latin, you'd call it causa sui. It's something that's the cause of itself. It's something that necessitates nothing else to exist. Now, this doesn't mean that a process is a spooky, immaterial thing like you might be thinking of when you first hear process philosophy. A substance would be something that needs no relationships to exist as it is. That means a tree, for example, would not be a Cartesian substance, because a tree needs the soil, it needs gravity, it needs oxygen, it needs the microbiome in the soil to grow, it needs nutrients, etc., etc. Whereas a Cartesian substance is really like the mystical thing there. It needs no other thing to exist as it does. It's not defined by its relations, it's defined sort of by how it is intrinsically. And that's why Spinoza, for example, called the only substance God. And this is the implicit idea of substance that we still have, even if it's just like, the very reductive materialist idea of atoms, bouncing into each other in the void. Those atoms would be substances.
Right. Now, we should introduce the process philosophers, and maybe we could skip Heraclitus and go straight into Bergson and Whitehead.
Yeah, that makes a great deal of sense, actually. Bergson, forgive me for going on historical tangents, and please stop me if it gets boring.
It's necessary. I'm not bored. Yeah. I don't think my audience would be bored.
Yeah, and your audience might actually know Bergson, because there's a tremendous book written by an objectivist historian actually called The Cave and the Light. And it contrasts the contributions that Plato and Aristotle have made to philosophy and to history. I highly recommend it, even though it has a very bad reading of Bergson and Nietzsche. It sort of calls them the killers of reason. And you can certainly read Bergson that way. Some of his contemporaries certainly did. But Bergson's position was essentially that before you start with abstraction, you need to stick with concrete experience. You can't abstract so far away from your experience that you lose touch with it. And that's basically his whole philosophical project. And that made him so wildly popular in his day that people would steal hair clippings from his barber. They would migrate to his summer villa just to see him. His lectures saved people from suicide, and he even caused the first traffic jam in New York.
I don't know if we have time to unpack that last point, but maybe perhaps for another day. But that sounds interesting.
Yeah.
We'll pin that one. I want to know that one.
Bergson was a tremendously interesting philosopher, very legible still to this day. If you want to read any process philosopher, I highly recommend starting with Bergson's essay, Time and Free Will, where he has that's one of my issues with objectivism that we might get into later, but I'd argue that Bergson has a far more robust account of what free will entails, and well, both what it entails and a proof for it.
And also, one of our members in our community, James the Liberated, he has an unlisted video about that subject. So I have a little bit of a taste on what that entails. Yeah, I actually just to review that video, even though it is unlisted, so I don't think James wished for anyone to see it, but I thought it was very novel, very interesting, and I thought it was very resonating. So there's that. That's my opinion on it. But
yes.
Anyways, what is the meat of this? What is the problem with substance, and why should we go for process?
To put it bluntly, because process allows us to make better sense of our experience. That's really the name of the game here. Process philosophers start with our experience of things, and then go, okay, which concepts can we use to best make sense of all of our experiences? Not just the parts in science, but, even aesthetic experiences, or not leaving out our day-to-day. What set of concepts, what conceptual scheme, what conceptual toolkit can we use here to sort of make these different aspects of our lives talk to each other, make sense, and allow us to even discover novel things? And substance, it turns out, doesn't make a lot of sense because you never really encounter a substance when you think about it. The objects of our day-to-day life, they're all processes. They're constantly changing, just like Heraclitus would have said. And the more you zoom in quantum mechanics, the more you see the fundamental building blocks of our reality, the more this seems to be the case.
I concur. Yes. What would be the metaphysical contradiction of saying that, well, the fundamental building blocks of reality are these substances that are independent from each other, and that do not rely on other substances to exist, to be?
Yeah.
Why does the most fundamental basic particles of reality need to be all interconnected, all dependent?
That's the thing. This is, I think, an sort of holdover from the way objectivists view metaphysics. But I'd argue substance metaphysics, just to defend my opponents briefly, they're perfectly internally consistent. Particularly the metaphysics that Spinoza, for example, has. It's perfectly consistent to say that the world works that way. At least it's perfectly internally consistent. But it isn't the most parsimonious explanation for our experiences. It doesn't make sense with new scientific discoveries. So it's internally consistent, but I'd say it does contradict some empirical facts. That's what I would say.
I would agree. However, I think there could possibly, we don't have to indulge on it right now, but I think there could possibly be a more deductive investigation on why this doesn't work, rather than it being merely a brute fact. But we don't need that for now. I think we can concur that with the advent of quantum physics, that it seems like the chaos just gets more chaotic as you look deeper and deeper.
The indeterminacy, precisely. That's what Whitehead really saw, that Whitehead's the main process philosopher. Just, I don't think we've mentioned him yet for the audience. Whitehead, yeah. We've
mentioned him by name, but we have not discussed of him directly yet. But we could do that right now.
Sure. Whitehead was, just to give you some context, he was a mathematical logician, co-wrote Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell, was actually Bertrand Russell's professor. And he took up William James's philosophy chair at Harvard without ever having attended a single philosophy lecture in his life. In fact, he bragged that his first philosophy lecture was the one that he gave. And he found a lot of dissatisfaction in substance philosophy and accounting for the new discoveries that science was making. He was sort of knee-deep in Einstein's general relativity theory. He was conversing with a lot of physicists working on quantum mechanics at the time, and he sort of synthesized this novel metaphysical framework with insights from science, from even romantic poetry that Ayn Rand herself would have liked to help make sense of our aesthetic experiences. And it's a monumental, titanic work called Process and Reality, which if you're going to read it, I recommend getting there's this smaller book called A Key to Whitehead's Process and Reality, because Whitehead is not an obscurantist on purpose, but he's as hard to read as Hegel or thereabouts.
I've read a little bit. I've read a little bit of the beginning of process philosophy, or sorry, process and reality. And I will say, while it is not dry, and I think it's, as it's advertised, I think it's pretty imaginative language right off the bat, even in the introduction. It is nevertheless complicated and very novel, and it might take a bit of brain power, a little bit of elbow juice to grasp what he's saying. You may need to reread a paragraph.
And if I may add one brief thing, the way our language works, or at least I'm assuming most viewers operate sort of on Indo-European subject-predicate languages, that predisposes us towards substance thinking. Whereas Chinese, for example, where some nouns do double duty for verbs, it's far easier for them to think in process ontologies. Which is why Taoism emerged there and why Buddhism became so popular.
Yes. All right. So now that we have established what is substance philosophy and what is process philosophy, the next question that I have, what is Panexperientialism?
So this is usually the tack I take when arguing with non-process people. I start with, in your ontology, how do you account for consciousness? And people don't give it much thought, but it's kind of weird, right, that we experience, that we aren't just zombies, that we aren't just going around the world mechanistically. Because after all, we're made out of, when you get down to it, we're made out of atoms. And if these atoms don't experience anything, why would a random configuration of them suddenly yield conscious experience? You can say it's complexity, sure, but then you'd have to ascribe, does a single switch have experience on-off? Maybe it does, who knows? If you think complexity is what generates experience, you have to go to those places. But the tack that Whitehead takes is this idea called Panexperientialism. He goes, consciousness isn't a problem to be solved, it's a metaphysical primary. So experience goes all the way down for Whitehead. So the smallest atoms, the smallest particles, they have some degree of very rudimentary experience. And then when you put them together in novel configurations, it's only natural that they would have greater intensities of experience.
Should we briefly go over the other positions to provide Panexperientialism with its oppositions? Sure, because this might sound crazy without context, without the opponents that Panexperientialism is working with. We're just going straight into the hippie shit without providing anything else. But yes. Exactly. But yes, go on.
To go even deeper into the hippie shit, we'd have something like Hegel's Idealism, or Bernardo Kastrup's modern analytic idealism, which is the idea that we should start with materialism or physicalism, because I believe that is the most popular and most intuitive position. And then we could probably go into a little bit of idealism, and then we'll lead back to going more in depth into Panexperientialism. Sure, we can do that as well. So physicalism implies that there is no consciousness. That's it's all matter in motion, and that there is no consciousness. So the really hardcore physicalists are illusionists. They believe that consciousness is an illusion, which of course is it's not internally consistent because something is experiencing an illusion. Ergo, there is something like experience. But then you have ideas which mesh well with physicalism, and most materialists will take this track called epiphenomenalism, which is this idea that consciousness is real, it emerges out of material processes, but it has no causal power over the processes from which it emerged. So think of it like your body casting a shadow on the ground. The shadow is there, it comes from your body, but the shadow doesn't move your body. And those materialists would argue that, or rather those epiphenomenalists would argue that your consciousness has no effect on your actions. It's just a byproduct of them.
You're looking, but you're not controlling.
Exactly. You're experiencing something, but your experience has no bearing on what you're actually doing. You only feel like it does.
I would say the most intuitive to the average layman would be something even more moderate than that, but something still along the lines. I would say that they probably would they would probably answer the question, the hard problem of consciousness, as you're still in control, but one day it will be explained all through physical processes. This is how the brain works. You get to this, you get to that, you get to that. Here are the steps. Here's how it all puts together like a machine. So I still think the layman still thinks of the brain like a machine, and then implicitly assumes an anti-free will position, even if they may hold free will otherwise, if that makes sense.
William James has this great quote, which is, of course, everything is caused, but of course we have free will. That's like the average person's position.
Exactly.
I'm probably butchering the quote, but it's the self-contradictory Cartesian position that people have, where somehow we really don't think about it, but consciousness is somehow this mystical faculty that grants us free will.
It's sort of like God of the gaps, but instead of God, it's free will. What we don't know is free will unless if it's explained otherwise.
Yes, exactly.
And the more that the average young person goes into university and particularly participates in the hard sciences like chemistry, or maybe even psychology too, or just general physics, the more and more that this gap is reduced by them being explained away with their mainstream school and teaching, they'll become more and more determinist over time as they realize that everything's controlling me. My material condition is controlling me, and the physics, the determinism, cause and effect is controlling me. While the average Christian, when you like, for example, or just like the average person, it's not explained away. Yes, God has a plan, but because I don't know what that plan is, it makes me feel like I have a choice, that God is giving me a choice, and God said I have a choice. It's whatever is not explained is my choice until it is explained, and then it's no longer my choice.
You can view it that way, certainly. And it's a sad thing that happens. You know, a lot of physics students get very depressed just by being physicalists. It can be a damaging worldview to have. But it puts me in mind of that quote that's often misattributed to Albert Einstein. I don't know who came up with it originally, where it's like, you know, one drink of the water of science makes you an atheist, but the bottom of the glass makes you a believer. And that's not the case for God, but it's definitely the case, at least it has been in my experience, for free will. Where the deeper you get into it, you sort of have to go past, like with economics, once you get past sort of the more mainstream stuff, you finally reach the Austrians. It's a similar thing to when you get past, I see the flag, when you get past sort of the mainstream physicalist conceptions of the universe, you reach these ideas that might seem wild, but actually offer a great deal more explanatory power than what's taught in academia today.
Right. Now, where were we? I'm not a very good interviewer. Before we were talking about, we should probably briefly go over idealism.
Yes, we were talking about the different opponents. And idealism is the idea, like, Randians hate this, and we've debated this, you know, between us multiple times.
Yes.
But it's the idea that reality is mental. So it's not the idea that your consciousness or my consciousness creates reality. It's the idea that reality is just this ginormous consciousness, and we're all living inside God's dream, essentially. You can put it that way.
The exact opposite of materialism.
The exact opposite, and I'd argue, like, here's the thing, right? In explanatory power, it's the same as Panexperientialism. Like, it accounts for the same facts that there is consciousness, but it doesn't account for the fact that I can't hear your thoughts, or I can't alter reality purely by wishing. So there has to be sort of a midpoint between idealism and physicalism, where it accounts for the lived experience of having consciousness, but not this radical departure from, you know, solidity, matter.
And as far as I know, the two positions in the middle we could call dualism and panexperientialism. So what about dualism, if hopefully I'm being clear enough?
Yes, dualism, there's multiple varieties of dualism. What I mentioned earlier with epiphenomenalism, that's a variety of dualism. called, and it's under the umbrella of non-interactionist dualism, where you have both consciousness and matter, or the physical, whatever you want to call it, but they don't interact. And there's a large variety of them. But then you have interactionist dualism, which is what Descartes believed in. He believed that God allowed consciousness, allowed the soul to interact with you. He had to like beam it into your brain.
And I would say that the objectivists would probably align with the former rather than the latter, even though you do say that they have a Cartesian past, lack of a better word.
A Cartesian heritage or something like that.
Thank
yes.
you. Yes, a Cartesian heritage.
It's not exclusively, and I don't say that as an insult. I mean, I've grown to disagree with Descartes, but he's one of those tremendous thinkers. Like, you can only wish to be half as inventive as Descartes was.
I agree. Yes, a great mind, whether we have whatever our opinions of him are.
Yeah.
So that is dualism. Now, to ask about maybe perhaps because we haven't. Maybe we should just briefly
circle back to
briefly just summarize Panexperientialism, and then we'll talk about actual occasions.
Sure. So Panexperientialism, again, is the idea that consciousness goes all the way down. The smallest bits of existence have consciousness in some proto form. It's not like your consciousness or my consciousness with complex concept formation, complex desires, emotions, but it is some form of subjective experience. And all that means is that it feels like something to be that.
Yes.
That's all it has to be.
That's all it has to be. Now, let's talk about particles and actual occasions, and then we'll lead that in. Then after that, we'll lead into the Panentheism, the fun part.
The fun part.
The part that will really rock my audience.
All right, fair. So actual occasions are Whitehead's atoms. And I'm using atom in the traditional Greek sense. They're the smallest indivisible part that makes up Whitehead's cosmos. So he hypothesizes that the cosmos, including space-time actually, not just material things, but the manifold in which everything occurs, is made up of those actual occasions, which are kind of, they're not round, they don't have a definite shape in that regard since they exist outside space-time, but you can sort of say certain things about them, and the idea is that they're living things, they're processes. So what happens is they take information from the past, decide on a course to take in the future, and then die and become an objective fact for the rest of the universe to build off of. And the idea is a lot of modern Whiteheadians nowadays think that, the fundamental particles discovered in physics might be those actual occasions. Because of the quantum indeterminacy principle, you can explain why particles take certain actions seemingly at random, not because they're undetermined, but because they're self-determined.
That is incredibly profound, because it both keeps causality while breaking determinism.
Yes, precisely, and that is Whitehead's... that's not why he did it, but his reason led him to that result in physics, sort of this very profound affirmation of free will.
All right, and I think we're ready to jump into Panentheism, and then after that we'll tie it back to objectivism and anarchism.
Sure. So Whitehead is a panentheist, which means if pantheism is the Spinozist and the Stoic position, which is that, God is everything, whereas panentheism is that God is in everything. So Whitehead has a conception of a God, but he's not the traditional Abrahamic deity ruling from beyond reality, issuing decrees, with the Ten Commandments. It's not a God. I mean, you can pray to it, but it doesn't have any power. What this God is, it's just the first actual occasion that transmits potentiality to the other actual occasions. So The idea is that this God serves as kind of like a conduit between potential and actual.
Now, if you were to speak with an objectivist, which you may in the comment section when this video is uploaded,
of course,
how would you argue against an objectivist who makes the argument such as, God, the position of theism, any sort of theism, is a primacy of consciousness fallacy? I would argue that since I heard this position, it was the first. I mean, except for Spinoza's scheme, it probably is the first, and definitely, in my opinion, the most resonating position for God. That is the most consistent with the primacy of existence.
I would argue the exact same thing, because when you think of the primacy of consciousness, you're thinking of a consciousness that determines the way reality is. That's not what Whitehead's God is doing.
Simply, Whitehead's God is just the mediator between the potential and the actual, as there must be a medium between the two, as we know that potential passes into actual.
Precisely. Like, it's not this thing that is building reality from nothing. It's not this thing that sits outside of reality. It's very much an immanent thing.
Right. So we got the naturalism, no supernaturalism. We are consistently within the primacy of existence instead of primacy of consciousness. And for those who are not aware of the primacy of existence / consciousness, click that video up there, whatever that link will be. Anyways.
Precisely.
Now, one more question, which is probably answered when you were explaining it, but for the audience to catch up and grasp, I'll ask the question. Why does this mediator have to be conscious? So that, like, if it's conscious, we can call it God.
Because Whitehead says that basically, if you're saying the entire universe is made up of actual occasions, you can't be like Descartes and say, oh, well, this is an exception. Descartes said everything is mind and matter except God, who is like somehow none of the above and has all these mystical powers to fill in all the gaps in my metaphysical scheme.
I hate mysticism.
Whitehead says, no, everything has to be an actual occasion. So God, therefore, is an actual occasion. And if it's an actual occasion, it must have the same properties as all the others, which includes consciousness or experience. But again, it's not like your consciousness or my consciousness. It's a level of proto-consciousness that would be difficult to imagine.
Be difficult to imagine. You have said before in the past that this God would also be omniscient. Is that correct?
Yes, but not omniscient in the traditional sense that he would know the future. So in traditional Einsteinian cosmology, you have what's called the block theory of time, where past, present, and future all exist at the same time. So it's sort of like how Australia exists now. Neither of us are in Australia, but we could go there, theoretically, and it would be there waiting for us. In Einstein's world, that's the same with the past and the future. For Whitehead, the future does not yet ontologically exist. It's being built moment by moment. So God, in this scheme, he knows all of the past because it prehends, that's Whitehead's term for sort of, perception. It's a very complicated scheme of what perception entails, but that's a whole other story. But it essentially since it serves as mediator between all actualities and all potentialities, it sort of touches on all potentialities and all actualities. So it knows everything that could happen, doesn't know what will happen, and knows everything that has happened.
And yet this knowledge is very proto. This consciousness is very proto. So I guess if I were to put my 2 cents on it, I would say that this sort of omniscient is, like you said, it's knowing what is currently and what could be and what was in the past. But its knowledge of it is, well, it's not on the level of a human, which is operating on rational and pre-rational knowledge and consciousness, and it's not operating on the animals, which is pre-rational. It's not operating as a plant, and it's not operating as a single-cell organism. It's operating something even lower than that. So it's, I guess I could say, its understanding of all its knowledge is incredibly low, but its capacity and its knowledge, its content of knowledge, is very vast.
Precisely. You could say that.
Precisely. I like that. So I think that's enough about stupid mysticism, because we're a bunch of ugly and dirty mystics for believing in God.
I can just imagine Existence University's comment under this video. I'm looking forward to it.
We will see.
University. We will see.
We will see. It could either be a response video, or it could just be a little comment saying "Okay, commie," or both.
Yeah.
So,
looking forward to it.
Speaking of Existence University, speaking of the objectivists, how shall we tie this to have like an open discussion with my audience, particularly appealing to the Zulu crowd, because my audience is made up of a bunch of Liquid Zulu members. So this is also this is more of an open-ended question, and I guess part of my very broad question is also about how can this process philosophy aid us in understanding and advocating for anarchism?
Is it fine if I start with your second question first?
Sure, I don't think the first one was very coherent, so.
No worries. But I think the two sort of go hand in hand. And I think I'm actually going to resort to a Rand quote, where it's essentially you can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. And I'd argue process philosophy helps you because it gives you a better grasp on reality. And we need, frankly, as anarchists, we need every single edge we can get.
Yes.
And hey, process philosophy, it helps you with science. They've made, thanks to process philosophy, there's been a ton of advancements made in biology. For example, look into Michael Levin's work. He's an amazing, amazing biologist. I'd be very disappointed if he doesn't win the Nobel Prize anytime soon. But that's just one example. How it helps us politically, well, it helps us ethically in a sense, because it's a very airtight justification for free will. And
I think a lot of libertarians, not necessarily within the Liquid Zulu crowd, but a lot of libertarians have a free will problem, which is a bit ironic since the pre-political use of the term libertarian was supposed to be a metaphysical position for free will, as the free will position is called libertarianism or metaphysical libertarianism. So it's quite a problem that a lot of libertarians, which a lot of the OG classical liberals, part of their justification for liberty was reliant on metaphysical libertarianism. It's quite problematic that a lot of libertarians, or so-called libertarians, dare I say, don't support metaphysical libertarianism. So, yes, it's best that we need to encourage metaphysical libertarianism as best as we can, especially with the Rothbardian community.
Yes, precisely. I completely agree with you.
Right. So that's how process philosophy can help. And I think another point that I think is worth mentioning is how I theorize or hypothesize that the substance philosophy within objectivism led it down to its political errors in its political philosophy. So do you have anything to say about how the substance philosophy created objectivism, and how this Liquid Zulu crowd could really even benefit further by adopting to a process philosophy, so that it can finally once and for all rid of this political illusion?
Sure. Well, I think Liquid Zulu himself is not guilty of this, and he's actually pointed out the error. Kudos to him. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of Randians have this very Hobbesian view of man, which they explicitly deny but implicitly accept. At least when it comes to their politics, where they think they need, it's a dog eat dog world. We need to grant a dog monopoly powers over the other dogs to, protect life, liberty, and property. And I think this comes from a very sort of substance approach where we're all completely isolated. We don't value our relationships with anyone else. It's this very crude idea of egoism where the community doesn't have value to the individual at all.
An irrational egoism, to clarify, for anyone who, for Existence University who will comment down, is like, that's not egoism.
For irrational egoism. Yes, and so I think that error already starts metaphysically. I think also not having a robust account of what consciousness is doesn't let you truly interact with, engage in dialogue with other philosophers to convince them of your positions if they see that you're philosophically ignorant about some of the most talked about issues today. They're just not going to take you seriously no matter how accurate your thoughts on politics or economics are. Furthermore, I think it's important to keep in mind that, Rand was very much right that mistakes in your premises reverberate across your entire philosophy.
Yep.
So it's very important to keep checking those, not only for internal consistency, but sort of ask yourself, do these ideas, do these axioms, do these concepts really help me make sense of reality? Or is this all useless abstraction? Am I mistaking the map for the territory here? What Whitehead actually called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness.
Right. Do you have anything else to say?
Yes, I would encourage. Sort of Ayn Rand was my start in philosophy, and I am infinitely grateful to her. But I would encourage all objectivists to sort of, especially take a look at the philosophers that the ARI does not want you to read. Just to spite them, because they're Ayn Rand said it best, I think. They're often nonsensical, but you don't know it's nonsense until you've been confronted with their ideas face to face and really thought them through and taken them seriously as unbiasedly as possible. So I would encourage you to do that.
To the regular Randians, I don't think they will hear this one out, but I do think a lot of people within the Liquid Zulu crowd and my audience have the potential to hear us out and hear you out, because I think that we've already been, with Liquid Zulu, he's already emphasized the danger of the Randian cult. And
yes,
I think we have reason to suspect this substance philosophy. It needs to be afuera, needs to be thrown out, replaced with the hippy dippy Heraclitean, everything is all in one, God is with us, blah, blah, blah. Let's drop acid. I think that wraps up our interview. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a sincere pleasure.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure. All right.